Inside Wormwood Scrubs prison in London, George Blake was waiting to escape. It was now 6:50 p.m. If he wasn't back in his cell by 7, guards would discover his absence. Blake grabbed his walkie-talkie and hissed, "You must throw the ladder now. You simply must." On the other side of the prison wall, his accomplice Sean Burke hurled a rope ladder over. Blake ran to the ladder and climbed up it. When he reached the top, he froze. The drop was 20 feet. Burke shouted from below, "Jump, jump, for Christ's sake, jump." George Blake had once been one of MI6's most promising officers, disciplined, brave, and trusted with Britain's most sensitive secrets. But somewhere along the way, that loyalty shifted. Blake passed every important document he touched to the KGB. For that betrayal, a British court handed him a sentence so crushing that Blake was determined to escape. George Blake wasn't actually born British. He was born on November 11, 1922, in a bourgeois household in Rotterdam, the Netherlands, to a Dutch mother and a Turkish-born father who fought for the British in World War I. After his dad died when he was 13, a letter arrived from an aunt in Cairo with the shocking news that his father was Jewish and had hidden his identity to get by. With his dad gone and money suddenly tight, his mother put George on a boat bound for Cairo to live with his rich aunt and her family. George moved into a mansion staffed with 10 servants and became fluent in French and English. But the comfort of his new life clashed with the poverty on the streets of Cairo.
I mean, the average Egyptian at the time in the 1930s is dying aged about 30. And his own uncle has this massive estate, this farm with many dirt poor laborers, children working from age 7. And that's where he sees this is poverty. This is just the worst poverty. We need to do something about it. So yeah, I think that's the moment in his life when he becomes open to communism.
In September 1939, Blake was back home in Rotterdam on holiday when war broke out and his world exploded. In May 1940, when the German Air Force bombed Rotterdam, Blake survived by hiding under a table with a metal pan on his head. Because he held a British passport, the Nazis interned him as an enemy national, but let him go as he was only 17. He immediately joined the Dutch resistance, delivering copies of the underground newspaper Free Netherlands to keep hope alive under occupation. Once he turned 18, the Nazis no longer saw him as harmless. Blake had to flee. He arrived in London in 1943, reuniting with his mother and sisters who had escaped earlier. Blake volunteered for the British Navy and trained as a diver for midget submarines, 1 or 2 man subs meant to sneak into enemy harbors and attach explosives beneath ships. But he wasn't cut out for the job, as he repeatedly blacked out during deep dive training. Another path was waiting for him. A Dutch-speaking major from MI6 noticed Blake's wartime record, his resistance work, his language skills, the fact that his father had fought for Britain in the First World War. Blake also wasn't a drinker nor a womanizer and had a calm temperament. To MI6, he seemed like the perfect spy, but as Blake later reflected, they didn't realize that throughout the war, my loyalty was to the anti-Nazi cause, not to Britain. A subtle warning of what was to come. At MI6, he was assigned to escort Dutch agents who had volunteered to parachute back into Nazi-occupied Netherlands as undercover operatives. Once the war ended, MI6's attention shifted from Nazis to the new enemy, the Soviet Union. MI6 eventually posted him to Seoul, South Korea as its first station chief, tasked with building spy networks against the new communist threat. When North Korea invaded the South in 1950, Britain joined the war with the United States rather than remain neutral, and Blake felt betrayed. American bombers flattened North Korean towns and villages, a reminder of the destruction of Rotterdam he had endured as a teen. When enemy forces reached Seoul, Blake was captured and forced onto a brutal winter death march in which half the prisoners died from starvation, disease, or execution. After months in captivity, Blake was moved to a remote farmhouse near Manpo, close to the Chinese border, where he remained for nearly 2 years. And then something remarkable happened. The Soviet embassy in Pyongyang sent a parcel of books by Marx and Lenin, hoping to plant Marxist ideas in the heads of bored, isolated Western prisoners. Blake devoured the books. Marxism struck him like a revelation. By late 1951, he made a choice. He wrote a note in Russian and handed it to a North Korean commander, asking to be put in contact with the KGB, who recruited him under the codename Diamid.
He was not driven at all by money. Money was never a consideration for him, and I think he asked the KGB not to pay him. He had come to the belief that communism was the right creed, and it was a kind of replacement for the Christianity that he'd grown up with.
In the spring of 1953, after Stalin died and tensions eased, North Korea freed its foreign prisoners, and Blake returned to Britain as a war hero. Despite recent defections by Guy Burgess and Donald MacLean, no one suspected he might have turned. Within weeks of returning to MI6 headquarters, he began his true mission. When his colleagues went out during lunch breaks, he stayed behind, pulling out a tiny Minix camera to photograph top-secret files. He'd pass it off to his KGB handler, Sergei Kondrashev, meeting him on London buses, at street corners, and in cinemas. At their first meeting in October 1953, Blake delivered full details of British wiretaps and bugs against the Soviets in Vienna and across Europe. The material was so sensitive that the KGB became convinced that he couldn't be a British plant. The CIA later estimated Blake handed over 4,700 pages of classified documents. In a BBC interview decades later, he was asked, "How much information did you hand over in that period?" "Well, that I cannot tell you." "Why not?" "Because it's so much." The greatest damage Blake inflicted was passing the KGB the names of hundreds of British agents and informants, businessmen, travelers, locals behind the Iron Curtain whose lives were now at risk. He knew how risky his double life was and that he shouldn't get married, but he fell in love with Gillian Allen, a young secretary at MI6, and they wed in September 1954. Soon after, MI6 sent him to Berlin, the epicenter of the Cold War, a city crawling with spies. Western intelligence was desperate to know if the Soviets were gearing up to start a war. So MI6 and the CIA secretly built a tunnel, half a mile long, burrowing from West Berlin into the Soviet sector to tap into Soviet military communication lines deep under East Berlin. During planning for the tunnel, Blake, who was the secretary, typed up the meeting notes. He then took a carbon copy and handed it to his KGB handler. But the KGB couldn't shut down the tunnel without exposing Blake. So Moscow looked the other way for months, pretending not to know. And ironically, it helped prevent war because Western analysts saw from intercepted traffic that the Soviet Union had no plans to invade Europe. When the Soviets finally staged an accidental discovery of the tunnel by blaming heavy rain for exposing cables, no one suspected Blake. But the perfect cover couldn't hold forever. In 1960, MI6 sent him to learn Arabic in Lebanon, suspiciously far away from the Cold War's front lines. It was a clear sign that the agency no longer fully trusted him, and they had good reason. An anonymous senior Eastern Bloc intelligence officer had written to the U.S. ambassador in Switzerland and enclosed a classified list of 26 Polish officials MI6 hoped to recruit. He claimed he got it from the KGB. The CIA instantly recognized the list because MI6 had shared it with them. There was only one explanation. There was a mole inside MI6. At the same time, British agents across Eastern Europe were vanishing. Some were executed. The anonymous letter writer turned out to be Mikhail Goleniewski, a senior Polish counterintelligence officer. He defected to West Berlin and confirmed MI6's worst fear, that the KGB had penetrated British intelligence. His information matched two other clues British investigators had. A warning from Horst Eitner, a Berlin double agent who had worked directly with Blake, and a list from Colonel Stefan Alster, a defecting Polish secret police chief explicitly naming Soviet spies, including George Blake. All the evidence pointed to George Blake being the mole. Becoming a spy is about analyzing problems, recognizing patterns, and thinking 3 steps ahead. And that kind of thinking is something you can train with Brilliant. Brilliant doesn't just give you formulas to memorize. It teaches you through hands-on problem solving so you really understand how things work. From algebra to college-level calculus, you're learning how to break down problems and build real intuition. One of my favorite courses is How AI Works. Predict the next word in this sentence. My name is... Most people instinctively choose Emma, but large language models like ChatGPT predict the most statistically likely next word, and the appears far more frequently after is than Emma. Brilliant is full of interactive lessons like that. Whether you're interested in computer science, programming, or science courses that teach you to think like an engineer, there's something for every skill level. You can start learning for free at brilliant.org/newsthink. The link is in the description, or by scanning the QR code on your screen. And Brilliant is giving Newsthink viewers 20% off an annual premium subscription, which gives you unlimited access to all of their courses. In March 1961, MI6 summoned Blake back to London for what he was told was a new posting. He was worried, but his KGB handler reassured him that London didn't suspect a thing. When he walked through the doors of his old office, he was immediately arrested. Blake was taken to an interrogation room and questioned by 3 MI6 officers. He had never discussed with the KGB about what to do if captured. For 2 days, he denied everything. Without a confession, he was close to being released. Then, on day 3, in a final attempt to break him, MI6's Harry Shergold suggested Blake must have cracked under torture and blackmail in the North Korean camp. Blake erupted, "No, nobody tortured me. No, nobody blackmailed me. I myself approached the Soviets and offered my services to them of my own accord." Inside MI6, the shock was so great that some officers cried. The British government now faced a crisis. MI6's very existence was still officially denied. How do you prosecute a crime committed inside an agency you can't legally admit exists? Prime Minister Harold Macmillan feared the scandal could bring down his government, but Dick White, the head of MI6, insisted Blake be put on trial. Blake chose not to challenge his confession in court. He didn't realize that if he had withdrawn it, the prosecution could have been left with no admissible evidence and he might have walked free. The judge sentenced him to 42 years in prison, the harshest sentence in British history for espionage at the time. In comparison, Klaus Fuchs, who gave the Soviets the bomb, received 14 years and served 9 for good behavior. My video on Fuchs is linked in the description. Blake was convinced they wanted to make an example out of him, and his foreign background made him an easy target. As he put it, "To betray, you first have to belong." I never belonged. MI6 concluded that Blake's betrayal had cost at least 40 lives and exposed hundreds of agents across the Soviet bloc. When the BBC pressed him on the scale of the damage, Blake replied, "I can't say, but it must have been, I don't know, but maybe 500, 600. But he wasn't sorry about betraying the agents, once explaining, "Those people who were betrayed were not innocent people. They were no better or worse than I am. It's all part of the intelligence world. If the man who turned me in came to my house today, I'd invite him to sit down and have a cup of tea." Blake arrived at Wormwood Scrubs prison in 1961, tormented by what he had done to his 3 young sons. During a visit from his wife, she asked for a divorce, saying she had fallen in love with another man. He became a model prisoner, reading, tutoring inmates in languages, and practicing yoga headstands. But the yoga wasn't for discipline. He was preparing his body for his escape. He met his accomplices inside Wormwood Scrubs. Sean Burke, a fiery Irishman imprisoned for mailing a homemade bomb to a police officer, became obsessed with helping him escape once he was released. 2 peace activists, Michael Randall and Pat Pottle, also agreed to help. Randall bought walkie-talkies and made a rope ladder from knitting needles. 5 years into his sentence, on the evening of October 22, 1966, Burke pulled up beside the prisoner's outer wall, disguised as a hospital visitor, carrying a bunch of pink chrysanthemums in which he hid his walkie-talkie. Inside Wormwood Scrubs, another inmate, a skilled burglar, had already sawed through the bars of a window. Blake managed to slip out and made his way to the outer wall, where he wedged himself into a narrow gap and waited nearly an hour, which felt like an eternity. Finally, Burke hurled the rope ladder over the 20-foot wall. Blake scrambled up. But when he reached the top, he froze. Burke had forgotten to attach the metal hook that was supposed to lock the ladder in place. He couldn't climb safely down the other side, so he did the only thing he could. He jumped and broke his wrist. Burke shoved him into the car and drove a few hundred yards to a tiny rented room. Prison officials didn't alert the police for 45 minutes. Inmates cheered when they heard the news of his escape. The most realistic path to freedom was through East Berlin. Just before Christmas 1966, Michael Randall and his wife Anne set off in a camper van with their toddlers in the back and George Blake curled up hidden beneath the seat. They drove across Europe and at last reached the East German border. Blake walked up to a guard and said calmly, "I am an Englishman. I would like to speak with a Soviet officer." By a stroke of luck, his former KGB handler Sergei Kondrashev happened to be in East Berlin. When he arrived at the checkpoint, Blake stared at him in disbelief. "You? Here?" Although Blake received a hero's welcome in Moscow, he was stunned by how bleak the city felt, the drunks, the shortages, the broken roads. He confided to a friend, "After a week in Moscow, I knew that communism was the biggest disappointment of my life."
I mean, that's what I said to him. This must have been an enormous crisis in your life. How did you get over that? And he said, I'm quite a cheerful guy. He moved on. He had a positive outlook. He said he inherited that from his mother. He realized, he's made a mistake. He's bet his all on communism. Communism is wrong. And he just thinks, right, I'll go on. I'll make something of this. And he does. He makes a whole new life in Moscow.
On a cruise along the Volga River in 1968, Blake met Ida, a French translator. They married and had a son. He eventually became a colonel in the KGB, yet he remained culturally British, drinking English tea with milk, listening to the BBC, and making Christmas pudding every year. He also remained spiritually Christian.
He's still at heart the Calvinist child from the Netherlands. He always remained a Christian, reading the Bible. The KGB spied on him in his apartment. They found him reading the Bible. That made them very suspicious.
But there was one part of his old life he couldn't rebuild. Blake didn't see his 3 sons from his first marriage for nearly 20 years. They weren't even told he was their biological father until their teens. When they finally visited him, they told him they wanted to return every year. In 1990, he wrote, "The 24 years I've lived in this country have been the most stable and happy period in my life." Michael Randall and Pat Pottle, the peace activists who smuggled him out, were finally tried in 1991. They openly admitted everything, but the jury acquitted them against the judge's instructions. Sean Burke, the Irishman who threw the rope ladder, had fled to Moscow but hated Soviet life, returned to Ireland, wrote and made a fortune from his book on the prison escape, drank heavily, and died of a heart attack at 47. George Blake wished he could stroll again in Rotterdam or London, but accepted that life had chosen otherwise.
He said, "Well, you've heard my story now. What do you think of it? Is there anything in my story that surprises you?" And I said, "Yeah, I am surprised. I'd expected a bitter man, a sad man, somebody whose life had gone the wrong way." And he laughed. He said, "I'm not bitter at all." He said, "Why would you think that? I'm a very happy man." So that was my great surprise, that he'd found a way to live with himself. So that really baffled me.
George Blake died in Moscow in December 2020 at the age of 98 and was buried with military honors in Moscow's Alley of Heroes. Thanks for watching. For Newsthink, I'm Cindy Palm.